Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you had an amazing half term. You managed to do a little bit of relaxing and we're back into work now. So we are going to start our poetry unit. So we are still with the AQA exam board. This is their poetry anthology. And we are starting with a poem called Ozymandias. Now, this lesson is intended to take you 2 hours, so there is nothing else you need to do for English. So you can either kind of split this up into sessions or just do it all in one, but this is all of the English that you will have for this week. Okay, so make sure that you have your poetry anthology or a copy of the poem that you can annotate. And please do send me any questions or concerns that you have. Make sure that you have a copy of the glossary that I have sent out to you. It's really important that you understand those poetic terms, that you feel confident in using them. And I want to see them more and more in your paragraphs. It's really important that we're using that technical terminology, particularly with poetry. So let's do it. Okay, so the first thing I'd like you to do is write today's date. The title is Ozymandias. And then underneath that, I would like you to write the word predictions. Now, Ozymandias is made up of two Greek words. The first one meaning heir and the second one meaning to rule. Now, given that Ozymandias is a poem about a pharaoh in ancient Egypt, I want you to think about what the literal translation of Ozymandias might be and how the pharaoh will be depicted within this poem. Take a couple of minutes to do that, please. Okay, it's just as important with poetry as it is with the other texts that we've studied, Macbeth and In Spectacles and Sign of Four, that you understand the context in which this poem was written. And this poem was written by a man called Percy B. Shelley. He wrote the poem in about 1818, and Shelley is a very well-known romantic poet. Now, when I say romantic poet, I don't mean as in lovey-dovey romance. I mean the literature and the art that was being produced at that time was called was dubbed part of the Romantic era. Now, Romantic poets, in short, really valued liberty and freedom of individuals, and they very often represented the common people, the kind of underdogs, the people who were being exploited. Now, that's really important to kind of understand that the Romantic movement was in reaction to what came before it. And what came before it was this age of enlightenment or age of reason. This is all about thinking and science and intellectual and very philosophical. Whereas the Romantic movement is more about emotion. And so the Romantic movement kind of speaks to the age of reason and says, yes, all of these things are important, but so are emotions and so are people. Part of that rebellion against what came before it was an answer to the Industrial Revolution, which came in the UK around about 1760 it started. So it had been going for about 50, 60 years before Shelley writes this poem. And during the Industrial Revolution, there's lots of social and economic changes. You know, things become mechanized and there's factories and steam engines. And as a result, work becomes much more regimented. It becomes much more disciplined. We move away from people working in the home, and lots of rural people moved and migrated to cities. And this causes this really dramatic lifestyle change. And we see through the Industrial Revolution that the gap between the people who have money and the people who haven't broadens, it widens. And the people with money, the people who own these factories and the mines, they don't provide very good safety conditions for the workers. So lots of people are getting injured or getting diseases like cancer from the air that they're breathing, diseases and coughs, all kinds of things are being developed. And these very wealthy factory owners, they just don't care. They just keep exploiting these workers. Even children and women were exploited. So the Romantics kind of stand up to that, and they give those people who are exploited a voice. So that's kind of what Romantic poetry and that Romantic movement is about. So Shelley, as a student, studied ancient Greece, which is probably why he uses the name Ozymandias. Because Ozymandias is the Greek version of Ramesses II, and you might have heard of Ramesses, an Egyptian who was a pharaoh, and he lived almost 100 years. He was a great warrior, and in order to show everyone his power, he made all of these statues and temples that were built to honor him and to symbolize this divine power. He almost saw himself as a god. So he insisted that all the engravings on these statues and on these plaques that were put up to honor his power were so deep that they couldn't be changed. They couldn't just be wiped off and somebody else write on top of it. So he very much felt that his power was permanent and nothing would ever change about it. And it was very important for him that he had this legacy that would survive time, it would survive history, and everyone for forevermore would fear him. And Shelley himself, who was very, very critical both of the British monarchy and of the government. Obviously, if he values freedom and liberty, he's going to be against those institutions which tried to curb that. He was a very big supporter of the French Revolution, and he could understand why the normal, everyday, common people would want to stand up to those people who were in power. And most of the people, when this poem was first published, would have seen these comparisons between Ozymandias, the pharaoh, and their contemporary counterparts like Napoleon. So in more recent times, we might think about people like Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Saddam Hussein. All of these people are examples of tyrannical rulers. So with that in mind, and please do make notes, you can pause this and write down some of these notes. Given all this, do you think that this poem will portray Ozymandias in a favourable light or not? And I want you to explain your answers. Again, this should only take you about 5 or 6 minutes to just jot down some answers. Okay, so let's talk about the poem and what it's about. So the narrator recounts or recalls the time when he got to meet a traveller who had come from an ancient land, maybe Egypt. And he's telling, this traveller is telling the narrator of this story of one day when he walked into the desert, and there he saw these remains of a massive statue that had now crumbled due to the erosion of time. And this statue is kind of half buried in the middle of this desert. And the statue is used as a metaphor, and it reveals the kind of person that this leader was, what his character was, and how foolish he was to ever think that he could hold on to his power forever, that people would fear him forevermore because of these statues. So there are two main voices in the poem, the traveller who's telling the story and Ozymandias. And we hear about Ozymandias's, we hear his words when we read the inscription on the pedestal that he's on. There is one other voice, and that's the narrator who does those first couple of lines. So multiple voices in this poem. And this poem can be seen as an analogy, a lesson that time will challenge any great ruler and time will always win. And that human power is ephemeral, it's not permanent, it is fleeting, it is transient. It will die when the person who has the power dies with it. and that power then is transferred to something or someone else. Okay, so again, feel free to make notes if you need to. I'd like you just to watch and to listen through this read through before we go ahead and start annotating. Okay, so we're going to annotate this poem. I've put on the screen in front of you my annotations. I suggest that you put these notes into your own words and don't write down any words that you don't understand. If there's something you don't know, look it up in the glossary. If you're still not sure, please do drop me a message and I will get back to you. But there's no point in just copying down these if you don't fully understand what it is you're writing. So starting with the title Ozymandias. Now you made some predictions at the beginning of this lesson about what the literal term means and how this poem might present this ruler. So Ozymandias means a ruler of air, and air essentially is nothing. So it's ironic that this ruler, this pharaoh who believes that he's almighty and all-powerful, his name literally translates to a ruler of nothing. So Ozymandias comes to symbolize political power and power of any kind really, as a metaphor for pride and hubris. So hubris is just a technical term for excessive pride. And the idea that essentially human power is fleeting. Essentially, you will be the ruler of nothing. So that's always really important to start with a title. You'll notice as well through the annotations, I have circled those ideas that link with conflict, because obviously the cluster of poems that we're doing in this anthology is power and conflict. So starting with the first line, I met a traveller from an antique land. So I is a personal pronoun, but this is not the speaker's story. He's simply retelling what he's been told. So even though it's from an I perspective, it actually creates some distance between the man who is narrating, or the woman who is narrating this poem, to what is being said. There is distance between them. And the antique land. So antique is a word that you can take two ways. Antique means that it may be very valuable, it's steeped in history, it's very dear, but antique can also mean old-fashioned and out of date. An antique land suggests that this is from an old land. This is not a modern land that this traveller has come from. So perhaps he is from Egypt or has come from Egypt on his travels. So antique there could suggest that that idea of trying to preserve power is an old idea. It's one that is no longer relevant anymore. It's no longer needed in today's modern society, and people in power should know this. Who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone." So the trunkless means it's had its trunk cut out. So the trunk goes kind of from your shoulders to your waist. That's totally missing. And if you think about what is held within your trunk, so you have your heart, so is now a heartless leader with all the connotations that go with that. And it's also a spineless leader. He has no backbone if he has no trunk. Okay, so the fact that it is trunkless, I think, is important, significant. And the statue is kind of barely standing. It has these two legs, but nothing on top. So it suggests that over time, the power of nature has reduced this statue, which is a metaphor for the pharaoh's power, down to nothing or almost nothing. And they stand in a desert. Near them on sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read. So what he's saying there is half sunk, so half sunk into the sand, a shattered visage. Now, a visage is just your face. So he's saying a broken face. So that the face of this statue has broken off and is half sunk into the sand. And it's almost unrecognizable. But do you remember I said that Ramesses wanted the carvings to be so deep that they could never be erased? So there is still some trace of his face left. And what bits can you pick out? You can pick out that there is a frown, a wrinkled lip, and a sneer. So if you think about the connotations of those words, think about how that shows the kind of pharaoh that he was. So think about the emotions that we attach with sneer and frown. Look at the alliteration of cold command, that very harsh k sound, which shows that he's not only just very powerful but very arrogant. And again, it's ironic because now there is really nothing left of him. He has nothing left to be proud of. There are no people for him to command. And these are the emotions, these are the expressions that which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocks them and the heart that fed. So mock, again, is a word that can be taken two words. To make a mock of something means to make a model of it or to make a copy of it, but also to mock something means to make fun of something. So he might here be suggesting that the person who carved this statue is mocking the leader, knowing that one day this statue will be reduced to nothing. His power will be reduced to nothing. There will be nothing left of him. So that idea of mocking has two meanings. And there is a pedestal on which this statue was once standing. So on this pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, that should say King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains. So, this idea of King of Kings. Now, if you are familiar with the Bible, that should kind of sound a little bit familiar. So that King of Kings is actually God himself. So he's kind of comparing himself to God, because what we're hearing now within these kind of quotation marks is Ozymandias's words that he has had inscripted on this pedestal. So he's almost calling himself a god, and he's daring anybody else. He's saying, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So he's being very authoritative. He's using that imperative. He's demanding people look, and he's demanding that people become frightened. So you can see his arrogance in his language. But despite all of this arrogance, despite all of this confidence and this authority, actually nothing remains. Round the decay of the colossal wreck. So it's not even a statue anymore. They're just broken bits of stone that are decaying. It's a wreck. Again, we hear that really kind of those very harsh sounds, the colossal and wreck, very discordant. We see the plosive, boundless and bare, the lone and level, again, alliteration all the way through, kind of highlights the barrenness of the desert. There is nobody to look upon his statue. There is nobody for him to frighten. So we see this, again, this futility of what was the purpose to build this statue, and building these kinds of statues would have taken a lot of men, a lot of manpower would have been needed, and those men would have been treated as slaves very cruelly. So again, link that back to Percy's I should say Shelley's intentions of highlighting this disparity between the people in power and how they treat the people that they're supposed to be serving, that they're supposed to be looking after, and the cruelty. So that word colossal obviously means vast or huge, but I think also that colossal wreck is a metaphor for his ego. His ego once was colossal, and now it is just a wreck. There is nothing. Also, that I think that the other word that I really want you to look at is the lone and level sands. Now, sand is very often linked to time, because we have that the sands through the hourglass. So that idea of time, and over time your power will be eroded. So again, think of this as an allegory where the statue in the poem is broken and falling apart in the desert. Nobody to care for it. Nobody is bothered by it. It's almost forgotten. And that's a warning to everyone, man or woman, who is in power, just to remind them that your power is also fleeting. So what you do with your power is maybe how you will be remembered. If you want to be remembered as someone who is great and good, then that's how you should treat the people that you are there to serve. And that idea of leveling sands, that idea of over time, we are all leveled. There is no one who is any better than anybody else. So it's really important when it comes to poetry that you are not just looking at language. Language is something we tend to focus on a lot. We do it in our language papers, and we also focus a lot on language in literature, but it's really important, more so than in the text that we have already studied, that in language we look at structure. Okay, structure is really, really important when it comes to poetry. Now, this poem is written in the form of a Petrarchan sonnet. So there are two main types of sonnets. We have the Petrarchan sonnet and we have the Shakespearean sonnet. So Petrarchan is named after the Italian poet who used the sonnets a lot, and the Shakespearean poet is obviously named after Shakespeare, who altered the Petrarchan sonnet a little bit in its form and has a much more strict rhyme scheme. Okay, so the Petrarchan sonnet doesn't necessarily follow the same rhyme scheme as a Shakespearean sonnet, but we'll go through that in a bit more detail when we look at some of the unseen poems. This is a Petrarchan sonnet. It has 14 lines. The first 8 lines are what we call an octave, and the second lot, the 6 lines, are a sestet. So octave is the technical poetic term for 8 lines, and sestet is the technical term for 6 lines, with 2 different rhyme patterns within each of the sections. Now, this form, the sonnet, is often chosen for love poetry, and Petrarch used to write a lot of love poetry in using this sonnet form, as does Shakespeare. His sonnet forms are all love poetry. But in this case, I think that Shelley uses this in an ironic way, because it's not the love for somebody else that he's kind of celebrating through using this sonnet form. It's the Pharaoh's love for himself, for his love of power and his love of ambition. So I think it's ironic. I think Shelley uses it purposely to make fun of the Pharaoh. So Shelley distances himself from the poem by putting the storyteller in the mouth of a traveller, of somebody else. We talked about that a little bit more, and we'll go back to that when we go through the questions. And there is some enjambment and caesura through this poem. Now, enjambment means when the line runs from one line to the next without any punctuation at the end of the line. It makes the poem flow, it can speed up the pace of a poem. But it's important to look at where you have enjambment and look at where you have caesura. So caesura is where you have a break in the middle of a line, and it's often used to emphasize either what comes before it or what's just about to come. It's a pause, so the reader has that moment to think. So again, any of these terms that you're not sure of, use your glossary. They will be in your glossary. And if you're still not sure of how it's used in this poem, then drop me an email. I will collect a group of kind of questions from everyone, and I'm happy to send out a response to you. In your essay that you will do for GCSE, you are going to be asked to compare poems. So you will get given one poem out of the anthology. We don't know what poem that's going to be. You'll find out the minute you open the exam paper. And you will have to compare that to another poem within the anthology. But the other poem will not be given to you. You will have to select the poem based on your own knowledge of the poetry. So quite often the examiner will ask you to compare an idea or a theme in the poem. So looking at the main ideas and themes within Ozymandias, the poem, is death and mortality. So the desert in this symbolizes the passing of time, that desert sand and that sand through the hourglass. It erases all trace of Ozymandias and reminds us that death will come to us all, and nobody is this idea of being a god and being immortal. You know, your time will come. So the other themes are themes of power. So Ozymandias felt that his power was absolute, that nobody could challenge it, that he would be forever as powerful as he was. But we see that the power of nature, the power of time, is far more great than human power. And when we read the words on his pedestal, we almost see it as being foolish rather than being scared of it. Pride, so we're looking at this kind of vast size of the statue, and that kind of represents or reflects the pride that this ruler has. The bigger the statue, the more proud that he was, the more arrogant he was, the more time, the more money it would have taken. So it's a reflection of his power and his pride. And I think the important bit is the futility of his pride is demonstrated by the fact that this statue is ruined. All of his achievements, everything that had come before, is brought down to nothing, which I think is where his name becomes significant, this translation of being a ruler of nothing. There is no point in humans having this excessive pride, this hubris, because ultimately it will come down to nothing. The other thing, and it's interesting, we look at this when we look at poems like My Last Duchess, the power of art. The achievements of the sculptor who created this statue actually outlive the king himself. And if you think about it, Shelley is writing this poem. This poem is probably going to be, well, you're studying it now, 200 years after it's written. It's going to continue to be studied. It's going to continue to be published in some form. It is now, in some ways, taken on a life of its own that will outlive its subject. And it will outlive the people in power, and it will relate to the next lot of people who come to power, and it will be a constant reminder. So that idea that art can outlive its subjects and therefore has a power of its own is important. Okay. I'd like you to watch this quick-fire revision just to refresh your memories about the poems if you're doing this in 2 sessions, and then answer questions 1 to 10. After you've answered questions 1 to 10, if you move on to the next slides, you will see that I've given you the answers, so you can check your answers. And then I would like you to do the extended writing task, the extended response. Write me 2 paragraphs and then send me the photo of your work so I can give you feedback to ensure that you've understood it. So watch this clip first and then have a go at answering the questions.